Hello, and welcome to this introductory lecture on Plato's Apology of Socrates. What I want to do in this lecture is give a brief historical background into many of the events that led up to the trial and death of Socrates. I also want to give a brief um, analysis of some of the major themes that take place in Plato's Apology of Socrates. So let's first start off by looking at some of the basic themes of the Apology. One of the ways to read the Apology of Socrates is that the Apology really shows the crisis of philosophy. And it's true that the historical Socrates was brought to trial by some Athenians who we'll look at here in a couple minutes. And this trial took place in 399 BC. It is a real historical event. Um, so, what you're reading here actually did take place. But it's also important to note that the trial is much bigger than the trial of the historical Socrates himself. It also really shows the crisis of philosophy itself. And I think when we're reading this dialogue, we should read it as representative, or the life of Socrates as representative of philosophy. So, Socrates here, he'll be brought to account before an Athenian jury, and he's really called upon to give a defense of himself and his own way of life, which would be the philosophic way of life. Okay, so on the one hand, here we have philosophy, represented by Socrates, giving an account of itself before the Athenian jury. But on the other hand, we also have the Athenian city itself on trial before the tribunal of philosophy. And what we're going to see if we read this dialogue closely is really the tension between philosophy and the city, or philosophy and poetry to speak more specifically. Okay, really at the heart of this dialogue is a conflict over who has the proper right to educate the Athenian youth. Should that education be one of philosophy, again represented by Socrates, or should that education be one of poetry, represented by many of the great Greek poets such as Homer or Aristophanes? Finally, we want to be thinking about the question of whether philosophy is good for the city or for political life. Okay, does philosophy really benefit the city? Or is there something subservient about philosophy that calls into question many of the most important beliefs and ideas of the city? Okay. So before looking at some of these questions we should consider as we're reading this dialogue, let me give some background information about Socrates himself. One of the things you'll want to note is that Socrates in his life never wrote anything down. Socrates authored no books, he wrote no treatises. All that we know about Socrates comes from his students. His most famous student is Plato, and we're reading here Plato's Apology of Socrates. And this is really Plato's own account of what took place at the trial of Socrates. However, Socrates also had other students, one of whom is named Xenophon. And Xenophon, he wrote his own Apology of Socrates. That's another dialogue that you could read at another time. It's a little bit shorter than Plato's account, but what we know about Socrates, the major point, is that it primarily comes from his students. Or what we know about Socrates comes from people like Plato, Xenophon. even a little bit from Aristotle and the Greek poet Aristophanes, who we'll be looking at here in a couple moments. Plato primarily wrote dialogues, and a dialogue is really a conversation, a recorded conversation between two or more people. And that's really how we learn about Socrates in the writings of Plato. We read about him in dialogue with or in conversation with other people, whether it's a prominent politician, a poet, an artisan, but we get to really see Socrates engaged in real life conversations with real people. Now, this trial took place in 399 BC, so roughly 400 years before the time of Christ. And we're still reading about this trial to this day, some, 2,400 years later. Okay, so it's a very famous dialogue. It's a great introductory text to the study of philosophy because it really raises many of the most important issues and questions that philosophy has to deal with. So I've listed 8 questions here on the screen, and these are questions that you should be thinking about as you read this dialogue. And the best way to read the dialogue is to really get into it and ask yourself, if you were sitting on the Athenian jury, based upon the testimony of Socrates and based upon his defense of himself, would you have voted for his acquittal? I mean, would you have voted to condemn Socrates, or would you have voted to release Socrates or free him from the charges that had been brought against him? Okay, so when you're reading this, try to read it as if you're actually participating in the trial itself. If you're one of the 501 jury members who were sitting around listening to Socrates defend himself and his way of life, how would you have voted regarding the fate of Socrates? And really, to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, does Socrates really defend himself against the charges that are brought against him? I mean, does he really give an adequate defense of himself and his way of life? Or maybe, possibly, does Socrates want to become a martyr for philosophy? Okay, does he want to spread philosophy by ultimately dying for it, which, as we know, is what happens. Okay. Another important question you want to think about is, why does Socrates change what the god had said? Now, really, to answer this question, you got to read real closely, and more than likely, on your first reading, a lot of this won't stand out. So if it didn't stand out to you, or if you haven't read it yet, you might have somewhat of an advantage here because you're listening to this first. But think about whether Socrates adequately represents what the Oracle of Delphi supposedly tells to his friend Chaerephon. Okay. Number 4, why does Socrates attempt to prove the god right or wrong? And we'll talk about more of this as we go here. Can we say that Socrates is trying to undermine the oracle by submitting the words of the oracle to reason, or trying to put the words of the oracle to the test of reason? Could this possibly be an act of impiety? That Socrates would be calling into question the authority of a very trusted religious authority. And finally, we should be thinking about, can the philosopher be a good citizen? Or is there something about philosophy itself, again represented by Socrates, that requires a human being to call into question certain beliefs, certain ideas that are really essential for you to be a good citizen. In short, can you be a philosopher and a good patriotic citizen? Finally, we can ask, did Socrates really believe in the gods? Or was he an atheist? And that's always a very interesting question to look into. Does Socrates engage in a lot of rhetoric here in order for him to appear to be religious and pious? Or is there a more hidden message, a hidden message that Socrates could be trying to convey, maybe calling into question the wisdom and authority of the gods? Okay. A little bit more here about the historical and political context of Socrates' trial. As stated previously, the trial took place in 399 BC. It's important to note as a historical side note that this trial of Socrates took place shortly after the end of the Peloponnesian War, which was nearly a 30-year war between the two most powerful Athenian city-states. On the one hand, we had Athens, and on the other hand, we had Sparta. And they engaged in a massive war called the Peloponnesian War. Most of what we know about this war comes from the Greek political historian Thucydides, who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Ultimately, to make a long story short, the war ends in 404 BC with the defeat of Athens and the installing of a pro-Spartan oligarchy, a regime known as the 30 Tyrants. So Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy and culture and the arts, ultimately loses this war to the Spartans. And the Spartans, because they have won the war, they institute their own government, which is very anti-democratic. And the government is being run by 30 tyrants. So it's an oligarchical form of government, a rule of the few. However, the rule of the 30 tyrants didn't last very long. They ruled for about 1 year when a democratic resistance movement led by many prominent Athenians, some of whom we'll read about in Plato's Apology of Socrates, ousted the 30 tyrants and reinstituted a democratic form of government. So what you see here is a map of many of the Greek city-states. So the country or the city-states there in yellow represent Sparta and Sparta's allies. The ones that are kind of orangish red represent Athens and her allies, and the green there represents neutral city-states. So you can see we have Athens here, right, close to the Aegean Sea, and we have Sparta here to its south. So this war, the Peloponnesian War, really engaged the entire Greek world, okay, and even some of the cities located in Asia Minor here. Okay, so this is a good map to give you a visual of where this conflict took place. A little bit more about the history of the Peloponnesian War and how it influenced the trial of death in Socrates. As stated previously, in 400 BC, Anytus, Meletus, and Lycos, all of whom had been part of the democratic resistance movement, brought charges against Socrates. And what's interesting to note here is that many of Socrates' students, many of his disciples, we could say, had been implicated with the rule of the 30 tyrants. So Socrates himself was not above suspicion. I mean, there was something about him and the people he associated with that really called into question his loyalty to the Athenian democracy. For example, a person named Critias, who happened to be a cousin of Plato, and another person named Charmides, who was Plato's uncle. Those two members were part of the 30 tyrants. So they were part of that pro-Spartan regime that ruled Athens for 1 year. Plato writes in one of his letters that he was invited by the 30 to join the government and to rule as a tyrant, as part of the 30 tyrants. But ultimately he refused that offer, preferring to devote his life to philosophy rather than to politics. So we have to conclude that just given the historical background of the Peloponnesian War, of many of the people who were involved in that war and the rule of the 30 tyrants, that Socrates' trial takes place on the backdrop of a highly charged political environment, one of conspiracy, betrayal, and really the ultimate defeat of Athens by the Spartans. So this is good historical information that were not given in the text. Of course, Plato writing this would assume that his reader knew that already, which they would have at the time. But just remember, there's something about this Socrates that called himself and his way of life into question. There was something about his activity and what he did that led people like Anytus and Meletus to bring charges against him. So that leads us to Meletus and Anytus. So both of them are written about in Plato's Apology of Socrates. Both of them were members of the democratic resistance movement that overthrew the 30 tyrants. Meletus, we can say, and as you've read in the text, or will read in the text, is really the chief prosecutor in the trial. Okay, he's one who is cross-examining Socrates. He's representative of the poets. Now, the term poets can be somewhat misleading. We tend in our day to identify poetry with literature, but really for the Greeks, poetry was directly connected to religion itself. It was thought that the poets, under divine inspiration, spoke on behalf of the gods. The same way in our day, in our time, we might think of a prophet speaking on behalf of God. For the Greeks, they understood the poets, whether it's Homer or any of the other famous poets from Greek history, to be speaking on behalf of the gods themselves. Anytus, on the other hand, happened to be an influential Athenian politician, a key member of the democratic resistance movement, a leading official who brought formal charges against Socrates, and instead of representing the poets, Anytus represents the interests of the politicians and the artisans. So you have two different interest groups here. You have the religious interest group and you have the political interest group that are both after Socrates. They both want to see him brought to justice. As you read the text, you'll note that there are two sets of accusations that are brought against Socrates. On the one hand, we have the older accusations that Socrates attributes to the Greek playwright Aristophanes. And on the other hand, we have the new accusations that Socrates attributes to Anytus and Meletus. Now, it's important to keep the two different sets of accusations distinct from one another, because Socrates ultimately begins by discussing the older charges that have been brought against him. And after discussing those charges, he transitions to discussing and defending himself against the new accusations. So the old accusations, Socrates says, were brought about by the Greek comic poet Aristophanes. And Aristophanes said that Socrates spends his time investigating the heavens and things beneath the earth, and that Socrates makes the worst argument the stronger. Okay, so what does this really mean here? What does it mean to say that Socrates spends his time investigating the heavens and the things beneath the earth? Well, really, to answer that question, we have to think about the domain or the region represented by the heavens and the things beneath the earth. And as we all know, whether we're from a religious background or not, the things in the heavens represent the things of the gods, and the things beneath the earth represent also the domain of the gods. So to say that Socrates spends his time investigating the heavens and the things beneath the earth is really to say that Socrates is meddling in the affairs of the gods, or that there's something about him that wants to investigate the claims of the gods, to see if whether what the gods are really saying is true or is just. The second of the older accusations says that Socrates makes the worst argument the stronger. Now, this might not be apparently clear to all of us, but to say that someone makes the worst argument the stronger is really to say that that person, in this case Socrates, has a way of distorting truth, that he has a certain rhetorical skill, a certain ability to manipulate words, to twist the truth, to make something that is really untrue appear to be true, and to make something that's true appear to be untrue. Essentially, what this charge means is that Socrates distorts the truth, that he really has no respect for the truth, and that he'll really say anything to win an argument, to win a debate, even if it means twisting the facts, twisting the truth. Okay. Now, for the new accusations, two distinct charges are brought by Anytus and Meletus. The first being impiety, not worshiping or believing in the gods of the city, and the second being corrupting the youth of Athens. Okay. Now, I'll raise this question to you now. Why do you think that Socrates discusses the older accusations? I mean, he's only brought to trial by Anytus and Meletus. He's not brought to trial by Aristophanes. So the question would be, why does he even bring up these older accusations? I mean, it would almost be as if someone was being brought to trial for armed robbery, for example, and during their defense started to bring up prior charges or prior accusations, maybe tax evasion, or maybe assault, or other theft charges. I mean, it would appear that if Socrates was really trying to make a good defense of himself, he wouldn't be bringing up older accusations. He would just spend his time focusing on the charges that have been brought against him, the new charges. So, I mean, that's a question we should be thinking about. Why does Socrates bring up these older charges? I mean, what could be his purpose in doing so? Okay, I have a brief slide here on Aristophanes. So there's actually a statue of him. And Aristophanes is very significant for understanding Socrates, for understanding the trial of Socrates, and really for understanding the alternative that he represents to philosophy. Probably Aristophanes' most known work is a work called The Clouds that was written in 423 BC. And it's really this work that Socrates has in mind when he says that Aristophanes created that original prejudice against him. In this work, which is intended to be a comedy, the purpose is to make people laugh in much the same way that a modern day comedy is meant to make you laugh. But in this work, he presents Socrates as a natural scientist, someone who's up in the air observing the clouds. I mean, really, we can think of the mad scientist who is so focused on his experiments and his observations that he's really out of touch with what's going on around him. He's so focused on what he's doing in the lab that he's oblivious to what's going on around him. That's much the way that Aristophanes presents Socrates in this work, The Clouds. He actually presents him as sitting in a basket, observing the clouds, doing the work of a natural scientist as the world around him goes about its daily business. Socrates is completely out of touch with what's going on. And to make matters worse, Aristophanes continues to mock Socrates throughout the clouds, saying that he mocks the gods, teaches incest of all things, and even gets children to turn against their parents by using physical force against them. To make matters worse, even worse than what they are, the play ends with Socrates' school being burned to the ground. Okay, as the kind of the last insult against Socrates. His school, his think tank, we could say, ends up being burned to the ground. It's this original prejudice that Socrates says Aristophanes has created against him. And that in so doing, Socrates thinks that many of the Athenians have been raised with this image of Socrates, that he's out of touch, he doesn't quite get it, he doesn't really serve any purpose to society, and that in fact he's really undermining society itself by mocking the gods, teaching incest, and children to beat their parents. So, one possible answer to the question I raised not too long ago about why Socrates brought up the older accusations leveled against him by Aristophanes could be because he thinks it's really impossible for him to have a fair trial, given the fact that many of the jurors have been raised with this understanding of Socrates, that he's really this type of person. Okay, the older accusations, we've covered this pretty well already, so I'm going to skip over this. Notice here the numbers and the letters I have at the top of the screen: 18C, 19C, and 23D. These are numbers that are uh, universally used in any edition of Plato's works. So regardless of the translation that you're reading, if you go to 18C, theoretically, you're going to be reading the same passage. So much like in the Bible, for instance, we have different chapters and verses, and regardless of the translation that you're using, you're going to go to that same chapter and that same passage. Well, in philosophy, in the works of Plato anyway, these numbers function the same way. Okay, so regardless of the translation or the edition that you're reading, 18C, that will relate the older set of accusations raised against Socrates, as well as 19C and 23D. Okay, so what about Socrates' defense against the old accusations?